I'm happy to be moderating the second panel here with an exceptional group of presenters. This panel will focus on the question, how can AI incorporate local knowledge? So it's the local AI panel. So we'll be joined by Catherine Griffiths of Columbia GSAPP, Dan Miller, Vernelle Noel, and Maya Indira Ganesh will be joining us remotely. Don't forget to scan the QR codes and submit your questions. Your questions will populate the spreadsheet that I'm staring at. They'll also be up there. So we'll try to somehow improvise between some of the questions I'll come up with and the questions you all will be submitting. So, Catherine?
So my research takes place at the intersection between what I call critical AI studies and computational design. And so today I want to share with you several parts of my design research methodology, specific tactics that I've developed to work with across my practice. And I think that these might be tactics that kind of offer a perspective to this question of how AI can incorporate local knowledge. So in my research, I'm always trying to understand the ways that algorithms, and today that frequently means machine learning systems, sort of shape socio-political dynamics, especially as they're deployed in socially sensitive domains. And so what I mean by socially sensitive for me could be in policing, in the workplace, in the home, systems and spaces that have perhaps not previously been subjected to autonomous AI decision-making systems. And my background with this work is partly in critical code studies, which is a group that considers source code as this kind of neglected but very omnipresent cultural text that should be available for humanistic interpretation. So it's a process of taking source code out of like the pure technicality and computer executability and bringing it into legibility, or maybe we could say locality today, for a broader audience. And so for me, that process extends into design, so critical code studies into design. So situatedness is maybe the first tactic that I want to offer as part of my design research methodology. So drawing on ideas from Donna Haraway's situated knowledges, thinking about Yanni Loukissas' concept of data settings and the importance of tracing provenance and data's origin story in data practices. So for me, this means that when I begin to analyze and explore a particular algorithm or a piece of source code or a prototype or a model, I'm always thinking about the relationship between agnosticism and context. In technology development, agnosticism is often something to be desired. Being contextless is maybe a good thing sometimes. But it feeds into ideas about technology as neutral and as disinterested. So in my work, situatedness entails working with a computational object that's always already embedded in a situation, in a geographic, cultural, political context from which its form can't be meaningfully extracted. And so in this sense, locality, place, origin, provenance, all the nuances of data are essential to understand the true socio-technical meaning of an algorithm. So in this work that I want to show a snippet of in terms of this situated tactic, so this project is situated in the home of my mother, and I'm looking at the kinds of data sets that the home is set to produce due to the incursion of machine learning technology into the home. So the idea of the home as a generator of data sets in the near future. So think smart doorbells and smart assistants, but also the way that the home is becoming a testing ground for the development of care robots. And the relationship of these things with the tradition of the home as deeply private and intimate and associated with the history of like gendered labor and unpaid labor. So counter data sets, it's another concurrent design tactic that I work with, which for me means building an alternative, maybe a local data set to probe the issues that I'm interested in. And so a counter data set could be an agonistic data set. It's meant to agonize the system. It could be community generated, artistic data, artisanal data, or some kind of data that kind of challenges the dominance of just big data and large models. So alongside, in this project, alongside filming my mother in her home, I also reenacted these domestic tasks to create an alternative motion data set. And I'm interested in the way that digital 3D asset libraries and data sets as a whole often embody this notion of agnosticism, this idea that they can be taken from one place and used somewhere else entirely. And I wanted to build a more politicized library of motions or activities. So in this case, pointing toward the gendered, unpaid, or low-paid labor that tends to take place in these spaces. And so in creating this situated data set, it's kind of partly about performance. There's a sort of reenactment of a person's life in there. There's maybe an element of like personal storytelling to the data set, including the filmed sequences, which I also consider a kind of data set. So reflexive software, another tactic that I work with that kind of evokes qualities of legibility for broader audiences or local stakeholders, we could say. So for me, this means, so in contrast to a traditional software development that produces tools to perform like extrinsic tasks, reflexive software development is trying to sort of critically reflect on its own code, its own processes, its own functions. A kind of visual unfolding of an algorithm into some of its socio-technical implications. Yanni Loukissas calls this interfaces that cause friction. I'm also thinking about James J. Brown's idea of computational rhetoric, the strategy of building arguments in and through software rather than just talking about software. And so as part of reflexive software development, it entails also just simply visualizing an algorithm. Visualizing an algorithm, spatializing an algorithm into its structure and processes. So this is a visualization of a simple machine learning classifier. And one of them is making decisions about who gets access to finance through a bank. And the next one is deciding who gets access to social housing and disability benefits. So they're very much algorithms of social consequences. And the idea is that because it's an interactive software, reflexive software, a user could probe the algorithm, sort of ask questions about it, see where, when the algorithm makes a mistake, things like that. And the colored circles that you see are real people that the algorithm is kind of parsing in real time. So for me, it's about bringing code from inside of the algorithm into a form of legibility and using a visual language to do that, to make it more accessible to kind of local audiences. Slow computation, or we could say slow AI now, is another tactic that was in that last visualization. So slow, this quality of slowness. That's not playing. Oh, there we are. So this is a similar process to the last software you saw, except represented differently. And so I'm thinking about visualization. The process of visualization and legibility is about purposely slowing down the computational process to meet a kind of human scale of perception and understanding. The nature of computation is something that tends to happen beyond the human scale of perception. It's obfuscated, it's technical, and It's a very abstract process. So for me, slow computation is a tactic to bring an algorithmic process back into legibility. Again, thinking about how knowledge emerges through computation and how we can find a way back into this relationship with the kind of knowledge that comes out of these systems. Oops, sorry. Okay, I had another video here, but it's not playing. Another thought that I made, this work is a few years old, and something that I thought recently with the incursion of sort of these massive models and big data sets is how these kind of algorithms start to feel to me like retro AI in their slowness and their smallness and their explainability. And I find that now, like following these big models that we have access to, sort of increasingly more interesting a concept to work with. Okay, so then counter algorithms is the final design tactic that I want to offer. And it's also about using ontology design, which I've found it to be a really useful way to become very conscious of the fact that models have worldviews, they have perspective. There's things that they can see and know, and then there's things that they can't see and can't know. And to some extent, paying attention to the things that models can't see and can't know is whose interests a model doesn't represent can be an interesting strategy, and I kind of call this unmodeling. So this is also part of a situated project, or situated studying of a series of algorithms, and it's situated within the Just Stop Oil climate activist group in London. It's a group that uses nonviolent direct action as their strategy, specifically a lot of slow marching to block roads. So it's a work that's about the shift between something that's legal, like slow marching, and then when it becomes illegal due to a change in the law to prevent climate activism. And so it's situated in the sense that I'm here in this group, part of it, documenting what they're doing. And then there's simultaneously another issue that's playing out alongside these actions, which is the role of policing and the state, who are simultaneously testing out machine learning like facial recognition and human activity recognition, and they tend to test them out in cases of protests and crowds gathering. So what you see here is like there are moments of this being a kind of testing ground for some of these activity recognition algorithms. And I started to be interested in this, thinking about ontology design, this idea of models having worldviews, So in this case, there's maybe two worldviews, maybe there's more, but I was interested in these two models where on the one hand, you've got the police testing out algorithms, what they see, what they know, what their goal is, which is to combat the threat of climate activism. And then you could have another model that's designed with a climate activist ontology, trying to combat the threat of climate collapse. And so it includes attributes about disruption and non-compliance and vandalism and getting arrested. And so ontology design for me became a way of kind of conceptualizing these worldviews with a group of people as well. And for me, even if whether this is a conceptual process or whether it's more a technical process that's also a piece of software, it speaks to accessibility and how to bring like local groups, communities, into how algorithms and models can be designed and with what values perhaps they're designed. So I'm just going to finish with a series of quick shots. Hopefully they play smoothly. They're a bit jittery earlier. So this is screenshots of the process of building a counter data set that's situated in this community. There's maybe an ethnographic quality to it in terms of this very particular type of activism that's taking place in London right now. and the concurrent policing strategies that are being developed to prevent it. So what you're seeing here is the process of annotating video footage to develop a data set. So it's including annotations for object recognition and pose estimation. So that means analyzing the body's kind of skeleton to understand what it's doing physically. And this annotation process is kind of attempting to build a data set that could model one of those ontologies that I showed just earlier. So I'm thinking about counter data, in this case, in the form of a community data set or a civic data set. I'm both shooting the footage of these activists as part of a community, also collecting other people's documentation who were there and shared it as part of the group's sort of media portal. I feel like it's a data set that can't be meaningfully extracted from its context. It can't be used anywhere else. It's inherently local. And even just the building of a data set in this way, the sort of, you can see that kind of some of the images work better as pieces of data. Others feel very scrappy. The aesthetics of the video, you can imagine, it makes building this model very difficult, right? So at this stage, for me, it's not about sort of how accurate or optimized a model like this could be. It's the process of designing it and thinking about the possibilities of this sort of counter-algorithmic imaginary. So these are all supposed to be moving at once, but it's so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I have been dropping pins. On my way to Avery Hall today from Brooklyn, my phone pinged global positioning satellites and other network services hundreds of times. These signals were sent to establish locations of my mobile device, and by proxy, me, my body, the bag I was carrying, as I move along a familiar route. I know where I'm going. I cut diagonally across an intersection to catch the R train on time. I walk just far enough down the length of the platform to match the set of staircases I'll need to take upon arrival at 116th Street. I move from one side of the train car to another over the course of an hour-long commute without much thought as doors open on alternating sides along the route. These positions, fed back to my phone post-ping in latitude and longitude, are subject to drift. As signals bounce off tall glass-clad buildings, they lag in reaching my phone's receiver underground. Dozens of apps on my phone make use of this information, coupling it with the speed of my phone, its bearing, and other ambiently cached metrics to smooth the appearance of drift and to keep me on track, reflecting my location back to me in a map interface, a still blue dot. Other applications will send this location information with an IP address and an ID number to a remote database where billions of other such locations from other mobile devices are being collected for processing. There, my pings will be aggregated into semantic categories and bins like home, work, entertainment, and an errant coordinate might be interpreted by the system in error as a visit to a point or place of interest along my route. I'm snapped to a place I've never experienced, a case of mistaken topology. Now, in the database, there is a record of me entering a venue I hadn't. This location intelligence system captures my knowledge of how to navigate a complex environment in the resolution of pings and flattens it into a format that can be used to sell ads, situate stores, and make decisions about zoning, thereby surveilling me and other people around me with their location services turned on. These generalized movements of my body and the time I spend anywhere are parsed into units of foot traffic, aligned with sidewalk center lines, and used to assemble routes and recommendations that will try to either concretize the path I just took or change my behavior in the future. This map-based data harvesting trajectory is increasingly suffused with machine learning methods, which are applied to automate complex data cleaning tasks and analyses. to more efficiently create a totalizing and digitized view of mostly commercial geographies with ever greater resolution. Local knowledge is being drawn into these systems, but abstracted and reduced to such an extent that is hardly recognizable to those from whom it was taken. We are assembling the map without being able to see our authorship within it. In this presentation, I will share my ongoing research into the ways in which artificial intelligence tools are being integrated into mapping systems. And I will argue that the prevalence and power of location intelligence platforms is supplanting local knowledge. Locale, or the material setting for social relations, is being replaced with location, a physical point that can be described in terms in the Cartesian system. I want to outline an agenda for countermapping these systems and their defaults. And I will focus on points or places of interest, which I just touched on briefly, as an opportunity for intervention, and I want to explore approaches to developing and computing location intelligence otherwise. The next few slides will show some patent diagrams that relate to developments in location intelligence that I'll also narrate. Location intelligence systems simultaneously deliver, represent, and recapture spatial data. The kind of intelligence that they advance is operationalized in many commercial sectors, mostly primarily business, retail, real estate, and transportation planning. It factors into site selection, supply chain optimization, and spatial customer segmentation. It also finds many applications in urban planning, logistics, and financial service and property technologies. This intelligence finds an outlet in everyday map use and ubiquitous platforms like Google and Apple Maps, where hundreds of data sets are brought together to construct a global interactive base map. Of course, the use patterns of these maps are also logged and processed, and in turn reflected back. Geospatial data companies have developed ways to structure and synthesize vast amounts of spatial information, integrate them within a web-based geographical information system, and deploy spatial analysis tools and models within a visual mapping environment, most likely a dashboard for display and decision-making. Location intelligence as a product and as a platform across the companies that operate in this space is constructed within a three-part structure, each element expressing certain attitudes about space and place. First is data collection and processing, gathering data from satellites, GPS devices, mobile phones, Internet of Things sensors, incorporating external data sets such as demographic information, economic indicators, weather and other environmental data, and standardizing data formats, processing for consistency and storing large volumes of dynamically updated information. Next is analytics and visualization, applying spatial statistics techniques, proximity analysis, and clustering to define relationships within the data harvested, and visualizing them in a map-based dashboard to facilitate some kind of decision-making process, as I mentioned. Last is integration and APIs, the part where application programming interfaces are sold as access to data as a service, providing compatibility with other business systems and cloud computing platforms. Each component of these location intelligence platforms is an opportunity for counter-cartographic intervention. Location intelligence companies are increasingly integrating machine learning and artificial intelligence, and I'll just provide a brief survey of what that looks like across those three distinct elements of the platform. Transformer models are utilized to combine various data sources at the data processing and ingestion phase, from text to images to numerical data, for then further processing. And supervised learning algorithms are set to tasks like entity resolution and disambiguation, for instance, to confirm that two addresses formatted slightly differently actually refer to the same physical location. In analytics and visualization, recurrent neural networks and long, short-term memory networks are fixed on historical and real-time geospatial data to predict future trends and behaviors. Companies like Here, formerly a part of Nokia, apply this to routing and traffic forecasting. Pattern recognition models identify trends or anomalies in movement of individuals or large groups of people as evidenced in their phone pings and foot traffic patterns. How these movements are interpreted might key off decision-making points handled by AI agents who are tasked with generating alerts, often with policing and insurance contexts. And natural language processing and transformer models are increasingly supporting the integration of text-based and verbal queries within dashboards and reporting. For instance, Mapbox utilizes natural language processing to allow developers to integrate voice-activated search into mobile map applications And the same platform, Mapbox, leverages AI-driven adaptive rendering to dynamically adjust your map view in detail in real time based on your use patterns of the map. These models represent, explain, and predict based on location data that are already generalized. Any local specificity that they may reflect is extremely limited. Location intelligence companies have adopted the lexicon of human geography, however, even if their products have a very thin relationship to the full breadth of geographic inquiry. Google and Foursquare refer to the content of their points of interest APIs as places. And this is the prominent product at the center of my work, points of interest, or POI. At a minimum, they are locations, coordinates that map users can visit digitally or physically. They are most often retail stores, restaurants, parks, or institutions, but can also represent events. Information about these locations can vary between data sets, and they generally reflect location, coordinate, contact information, and function or a place categories, such as store, restaurant, landmark, ATM. These are excerpts from Overture Places dataset, which is a 53 million points open source version of this that's offered by Microsoft as a competitor to what's happening with Google and other location intelligence platforms that have them behind paywall. The largest POI data sets synthesize and conflate records from hundreds of unique providers into a single source like this. They may be crowdsourced, derived from points, added manually to platforms like OpenStreetMap. And as an aside, what was once a kind of manual crowdsourcing process is now also suffused with an artificial intelligence overlay. The main mode of editing OpenStreetMap first asks you to either verify or validate now something that has been derived from a machine learning process. POI are also gathered directly from businesses and clearinghouse databases and directories, and they are derived from governments and municipalities with open data listings of institutions. They're also scraped from the web through automated text mining workflows on social media sites, but largely they are a result of those pings that I narrated in the first section of this presentation for mobile devices, pooling them around points where people spend time or where phones spend time, and prompting certain users, as is the case with Foursquare, to validate and edit information about the place. This is a very limited lens through which to view and represent the complexity and many scales of place. And those limitations are cause for concern given the prevalence, influence, and power that location intelligence products and the POIs that they produce have in structuring the physical world and our relationship to it. As a digital geography, they more closely resemble non-places, almost resisting experience and streamlined for consumption. The discourse on differences between space and place and representations of the two in geography is complex. But what I'm most interested in this research on POIs is in recovering the experiential and difficult to map aspects of place within our digital systems and trying to create alternate systems for relating to place and representing them at the scale of the corpus, collection, or archive. I want to respond to some critique of the idea first of an intelligence being mobilized based on spatial data science techniques. The fundamental assumption of all spatial analysis is conveyed in Waldo Tobler's first law of geography. He offers, everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. First advanced in 1969 through a presentation on a paper on urban growth simulations, Tobler's idea props up location intelligence as a means to compute and describe the relationships between geographic entities. Geography, expressed in billions of observations of proximity, position, and movement. Insight into location reliant on spatial clustering algorithms, and relations described in terms of autocorrelation. Feminists, abolitionists, and queer geographers would argue that relationships to place, and by extension, local knowledge that draws from experience, specificity, and context, are not structured this way. That is to say that not everyone in every place is related and that social, cultural, and political factors deeply influence relationality beyond the dimensions of physical distance. I'm interested in questioning the assumptions of spatial proximity, relationality, and neutrality embedded within location intelligence platforms, and in looking for ways in which computation and AI systems might support alternate representations of place as more fluid, performative, contextualized, that are mindful of the politics of visibility and invisibility. From spatial autoregression with its observed points within Cartesian space to transformer models perhaps with their embeddings in many dimensions. Local AI might afford counter mappings of Tobler's world. How do you make a map of places of experience? To move from a location to locale, I'm interested in working with large collections of text or corpora. They are alternate, specific, sometimes historical sources of local knowledge, memory, and witnessing that can be spatial but not always mappable to coordinates. Approaching a corpus as a knowledge base, guided by an understanding of how it was constructed, can support multitudinous and varied spatial computations. I'm interested in techniques for reading text more like maps, in a way that allows for abstraction and synthesis, but also is firmly tied to close reading, directed by spatial structures within the text. I've approached this so far not to incorporate local knowledge into AI systems, but rather to adapt machine learning techniques through source analysis, make careful arguments for scale and scope when defining locality, and draw out and re-represent location knowledge or local knowledge in new formats. AI resides in a hybrid space for me that assists with representation and interpretation. I'm interested in looking at places as embedded within models. Each place, like a specific living room, courtyard, shed, positioned relative to similar words based on the context in which they appear. Thousands of dimensions define their relationship to one another, and they are only related because they are uttered or documented within the same text or collection of texts. I'm currently collaborating with a team of Holocaust historians, geographers, and data scientists to work with nearly 1,000 survivor testimonies collected at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. This team acknowledges that the Holocaust was not limited to iconic places like Auschwitz and the Warsaw Ghetto. It transformed ordinary places, city streets, public squares, farm fields, forests, but most of them are not mappable to coordinates, but collectively they construct a landscape of recounting. The project is creating the first place-based text and mapping platform for studying these survivor testimonies that is not rooted in perpetrator documentation. To begin, we wanted to create a method for identifying all manner of places that appear in transcribed interviews. We adapted a list of categories based on our research interests and close reading of dozens of interviews. So 2 such examples of categories that resist mapping but are still very important as places within this corpus are interior spaces and spatial objects, where a pocket or a car or a book or a doorway can become a place of experience. This is an example of this, kind of reflected back along an individual transcript of an interview. This tagging process, the category is adapted through the development of a named entity recognition model and applied to the corpus to provide an assistive reading. And finally, what emerged as 32,000 unique places within this corpus are mapped within an embedding space, refined on the corpus of interviews, where distance between the points in this visualization here, categorized, or rather visualized by category and the colors, distance between the points describes semantic relationships between places in thousands of dimensions within the model. These landscapes of word vectors represent all of the contexts that a particular place is mentioned within. Places of similar meaning have similar vectors and similar positions in this visualization across categories and scales. As location intelligence systems continue to incorporate AI tools into their platforms, I'm motivated to continue framing a critique of them, highlighting the implications of their data processing and curation practices on physical and digital geographies, and in turn, engaging new ways to work with local knowledge and knowledge bases spatially, expanding other forms of computing and representation of place. Thank you.
All right, good morning. 2 minutes before afternoon. Good morning, everyone. Thank you much for being here, and such a pleasure to follow such lovely talks. Today we were tasked with asking questions about the local and AI. And just a brief introduction, in my work, I look into embodied creative practices, for example, craft practices, technological practices, and how these things intersect with society. Why? To undo damages that might be social, cultural, technical, conceptual, pedagogical, any of the above. of the past and today, and to prevent them from occurring in the future, to improve current and future processes, theories, and pedagogy, and to consider the small repairs that we might make and their larger social implications. So, how can AI incorporate local knowledge is the question we were tasked with. And my reframing of that question is one in the form of three questions. The question for me was framed as a technical one. I want to reframe it socio-technically. So how can we use AI, because we are agentic beings, right, in ways that incorporate local knowledge? How can we privilege local knowledge? And how can we privilege local and other knowledges and values to responsibly employ AI? And one framework through which I approach my research in computational design is what I call a situated computations approach. And this is an approach to computational design research, practice, or pedagogy that grounds our tools, our methods, and our theories in the social world by acknowledging the historical, cultural, and material contexts of design and the making. I think you've seen that in the presentations before me. It responds to a setting's social and technological infrastructure, and it asks that we refuse to remain ignorant of the social and political structures that shape our work. Currently, there are 8 principles sort of to get me started on what this looks like. But the project I'm going to share with you today is a project around Carnival and artificial intelligence. This was funded by the Mozilla Foundation. And from that framework, but before I share the work with you, I should say, I must first share the historical and cultural contexts of the Carnival, of the work I'm going to speak about, so that we are all informed of the social and political structures that shape the Carnival and inform my approach to the work. So here are photos of events in the Trinidad Carnival. I'm in New York, so many of you should know about Carnival. Labor Day, yeah? All right, good, good. And so the term Trinidad Carnival or Trinidad and Tobago Carnival does not bound the carnival to the geographic location, but instead situates its origin and the main elements defining the carnival. The 3 main elements that define the Trinidad Carnival are its mass or masquerade, calypso and soca music, which is music or rhythm or storytelling native to Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, and the steel pan or steel drum or musical instrument, which was invented by the African working class in the 1930s in Trinidad and Tobago from old discarded oil drums. And it's all over the world now, right? The Trinidad Carnival is tied to slavery. The first record of enslavement in Trinidad was in 1606. French planters introduced carnival to Trinidad in the 1780s. While Africans engaged in carnival festivities during enslavement, after slavery was abolished in 1834, those formerly enslaved reinvented the carnival to celebrate their freedom, express their creativity, their aesthetic sensibilities, and reclaim their humanity in the face of a system that considered them less than human. While the French and other Europeans participated in carnival for fun and frolic, for those of African descent, carnival was like a religion, cathartic, a psychological release from tensions and stresses of oppression, segregation, and violent, inhumane systems of control. The Trinidad Carnival has been exported to several parts of the world, creating economies, adding to GDPs. It has spread to other parts of the Caribbean, the UK, Nottingham Carnival, Canada, Europe, and many parts of the US, okay? Carnival is rooted in expressions of joy, creativity, and innovation. Here are photos of masqueraders performing costumes during Carnival. It's also rooted in celebrating resistance and emancipation from enslavement, from the dangerous, cruel, forced labor and its many other materializations. These are images of Jab-Jabs and Blue Devil characters from Juve, and they originate from that celebration of resistance from enslavement and forced labor. I want you to remember these images as they'll show up later. Carnival is also rooted in community, with social interaction and togetherness, mentoring and cooperation, community engagement, where people come together to design, to make costumes and dancing sculptures for the carnival, to teach and learn, organize, and engage in events in communities. It's about public education. This is a photo of George Bailey's band from 1957. I think of Carnival as the internet of that time. Public education in art, history, storytelling, society, all of it wrapped up in Carnival. People portrayed and educated our publics on histories, both real and imagined, past and future. They showcase their creativity, innovation, and beauty using everyday materials. Carnival is about seemingly disparate things dwelling together: enslavement and freedom, good and evil, scary and beautiful. It's a space of entanglements. It's about innovations in craft, design, showcasing aesthetic sensibilities. This is a photo of wire bending, a craft practice that was integral to the design and fabrication of costumes and dancing sculptures in Carnival. The craft began in the 1930s, where linear materials such as wire, etc., are sculpted to create costumes and dancing sculptures. In the 1930s, scholars referred to this craft as the most highly developed of Carnival crafts. On the left, a photo from 1969, and on the right, Stephen Derrick, one of my informants in my research who has since passed away. But this craft is at risk of dying, and this is also part of my work. It's about design and creative expression. Here are dancing sculptures, or kings and queens of Carnival. These large artifacts are expressions of creativity, technical skill, innovation, and commentary on social, political, and environmental issues occurring locally, regionally, and globally. So, now that we're all up to speed on Carnival, the problems that some of my work addresses include a loss and a trivializing of people's histories and cultures, and what that means for education, the disappearance of knowledges and contributions, people's contributions, and the technological interventions and discourses that we might engage in or be part of that are often devoid of context, as I think I heard well from Dan. So the vision of this work was a creative community that engages with, learns about, and interrogates AI to benefit themselves and contribute to discourses on AI through cultural practices in Carnival. So how might we use AI in ways that incorporate local knowledge, that privilege local knowledge, and that privilege other kinds of knowledges and values important here, to responsibly employ AI? So these are just some videos so you could get a sense of the excitement of Carnival. So dancing sculptures, Juve, mass, etc. And the project that I'm going to show you includes 3 virtual events that draw on these real events of kings and queens in Carnival, Juve, and mass. Here is a video of a dancing sculpture in Carnival. This is Pacific Tsunami by Wade Madre from 2011. And so the question, or the project, this project is from 2020, right? So it's like a granddad of a project now, right? We have a data set of images of dancing sculptures and what might be generated by playing with this data set. Here are some of the dancing sculptures that generative AI imagined. And so these possibilities for dancing sculptures and design in Carnival can reconnect people to their history, connect them to possible futures, while also having an impact on design and making cultures. So it's not just about the thing, but about what the thing facilitates. imagination of new or old futures. Right? So here's a video of Blue Devil characters in Juve that celebrate emancipation of enslaved people and the abolition of slavery in Trinidad and Tobago. And these are AI-generated Blue Devils and Jab-Jabs. What they are not, I have no clue, but I find them absolutely engaging. And so in addition to exploring these generative possibilities, the project included building a series of virtual immersive experiences to showcase these explorations. So a virtual gallery, a virtual Juve, and a virtual mass, but I'll show two of them. Here is the virtual gallery, which contains some of these AI-generated dancing sculptures. In the space, there's audio describing and educating our publics on AI, on what it is, as well as about what Carnival is and its histories. This project occurred during the pandemic when several carnivals could not happen. So this was a digital online space that allowed people to engage with each other and engage in the carnival in some way, all right? Best that we could. Here is a short video of the virtual Juve experience, which showcases AI-generated Jab-Jabs, Blue Devils, and Jab Molasses, with, again, videos, images, and music, and audio describing Juve with its scary, beautiful parts. This work was exhibited in 2022 at the Contemporary Gallery in Berlin, so these are just some images of that. And so back to these questions, how can we use AI in ways that incorporate local knowledge, privilege local knowledge, and engage with the values and knowledges of other contexts so that there's a responsible deployment or employment of AI? And my answer to that, I tied back to situated computations by the answer being by grounding our tools and our methods in the social world and acknowledging the historical, cultural, material, etc. context of our technological sites, by responding to our settings and refusing to remain ignorant of social and political structures that shape our AI tools and methods, so that we create space for and participation in these discourses by those who are often missing, so that we resist the segregation and privileging of certain types of knowledges, and that we amplify the stories of historically excluded or marginalized groups. As Catherine quoted Yanni, data alone cannot entirely supplant other ways of knowing, and sometimes we often forget that as we tinker with these technological tools over and over again. So that is my thoughts on how we might think about data, AI, and the local, and a sort of reframing of the situated computations framework and what it might look when it comes to data. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Well, hi everyone, and thank you so much for this invitation to be part of this event, especially to Laura. Hi, Laura. And to Catherine. Hi again, Catherine. I'm really delighted to be part of this panel and this wonderful series of events. I'm really sorry not to be in the room with you today, but there's another major conference going on here in the UK. It's called the Association of Internet Researchers, where I've been. I just would not have made it to New York in time for this event. So I'm going to get right into it and talk about the question of the local. And I've been chewing over this and trying to think about this in the way that, in the way that actors and performers, they do this sort of dramatic exercise in which they will emphasize different parts of a sentence or a statement. In this case, how can AI incorporate local knowledge? And that's what was running through my mind as I was trying to put this talk and this presentation together. I was trying to sort of like emphasize each of these different words to identify the different kinds of meanings that were coming through. And in doing so, sort of highlight some of the poetics and the politics of this system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about art and politics, but eventually move to talking about a research project I've been part of called AI in the Street. So first, to think about what AI really is in terms of a globe-spanning socio-technical aspirational infrastructure, but also as a kind of ideological apparatus, from its supply chains to its bombastic overlords and its regulatory regimes. It is not just one thing, but there's this vast surface area of engagement with AI that all of us are somehow kind of getting drawn into, whether we want to or not. Um, and of course, I'm talking about generative AI here. You could argue that generative AI is actually kind of local, as it sort of searches and thinking about text-based systems, not so much image generation, searches for the next most likely thing to occur in pieces of text. But at the same time, what is likely to occur next is highly situated based on the kinds of data that a model is fed. So there's a way that locality as nearness can actually also be quite exclusionary if you consider, the fact that a lot of data sets are very situated in space, as others have spoken of already. So I'm thinking here about the work of the software theorist Wendy Chun in her book Discriminating Data, where she talks about this idea of homophily, the idea of, birds of a feather flocking together, that has underlaid the organization of racially segregated housing in the US. The idea that similarity breeds cohesion, but in fact, and locality or nearness that is homogeneous is actually less likely to be successful in cohesion, argues Chun. What she says enables cohesion is actually noise and difference. But what it takes to set up a social infrastructure for encouraging and handling noise and difference requires political will. It requires effort. So I want to move away for a moment from the sort of scale of ChatGPT or Midjourney and think about AI models as technologies that could also potentially be customized into something smaller and more local. There's an interesting example, a sort of inspirational example from the artists Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst in their recently commissioned work for the Whitney Biennial called X Hairy Mutant. This was on show, visible in New York at the Whitney, but it's also online, and I think you can find it on their website. So they created an image generation model based on a data set of images about Herndon, who is distinctive for the color of her hair. And what they did was they created this model based on lots of images of Herndon, and they installed an interface that could encourage users to construct prompts that would result in something based on the detail of her hair. And I invite you to try it. The results can be quite funny and compelling. I think the idea that a small and bespoke and custom model in which users have control and creativity is a sort of intriguing way to start thinking about locality within the kinds of technologies that we have and their affordances. There is, of course, the risk that if locality is not diverse and complex and messy, we will get narrow results. But as Herndon and Dryhurst argue, and as they show, the model is the artwork, not the output. And I think this sort of sets itself up as a kind of productive challenge for us. So the model is one thing, but the physical locality of AI is also something that I want to acknowledge, that going back to the emphasis of what AI actually is, AI is also its material and environmental infrastructures. So to be local to a data center or power plants or to the site of extraction of materials and minerals required to build phones and computers is a consideration of the local that I don't want to lose sight of in this discussion. And I want to sort of, given all of that, I want to talk about two sort of contemporary situations that we're facing right now in the UK and in many different parts of the world in different ways. So, and thinking very much first about a situation of, application of AI technologies in the UK, in the streets of the UK. A few months ago, we had a really horrific incident, the murder of 3 young girls that resulted in very egregious violence against racialized communities here, that was fanned by social media. and by far-right communities here that were using social media, but also AI and sound apps like Suno, messaging apps like Telegram, and of course, the sort of algorithmically amplified messages circulating in these spaces. There was disinformation being circulated about religious and ethnic minorities who they said were responsible for this attack, which were completely wrong. And we've had far-right protests in the streets and police also in the streets. Sorry, I'm just having an issue with my slides there. The other thing to mention is also the protests against the ongoing Israeli state violence against Palestine and Lebanon. And there's been a large-scale deployment of facial recognition technology on the streets, and 29 arrests so far on this basis for public disorder and criminal activity in the UK. And that's actually just a picture from when our encampment in Cambridge, just down the street from here, was dismantled in September. We haven't actually had anything like that, sort of like police incidents here, but in London, in the context of protests, we have definitely seen the use of facial recognition technologies. And then I want to move to, in the time I have left, actually talking about another set of work that is very much about the street and situated in place and in the space of Cambridge. It's a research project, a scoping project that's been ongoing for the last 6 months, led by Professor Norcha Merez from the University of Warwick and Professor Alex Taylor in Edinburgh. What we did was we set up different street observatories as part of this project called AI in the Street. 5 street observatories in the UK and in Australia. And I'm just going to talk about the Cambridge Street Observatory that my colleague, Dr. Louise Hickman, and I have been part of. So Louise is a scholar of access and technology and disability. She's also a wheelchair user and deaf, and has been using access data walks as a method to activate attention to how disabled people move through space. One of the ways that we sort of tend to think about accessibility is really about sort of entering and exiting buildings. So, you know, in terms of ramps. But what I really loved about Louise's method of the access data walk is to think about how disabled people actually want to move through space and to think about mobility in space. So what we thought we would do as part of the Cambridge Street Observatory was to do an access data walk to understand how AI manifests and the promises it makes and what those promises might mean for somebody who is disabled. So we did an access data walk with members of the Cambridge Council. This is our local governance. And what you see actually, what you should see on the bottom of the screen is a hand-drawn map. So an access data walk is usually accompanied by we give lots of media to people where they can record their experiences of moving through space. So that's a hand-drawn map by one of the participants in our observatory. Now, Cambridge is a really small 800,000-year-old town with a strange sort of change and continuity at work here. So the town has really grown in terms of its heterogeneity, its its size, though the physical space is sort of still, you know, what it always has been. It's expanding, but there's a revolving door of new students. There's crumbling old infrastructure, narrow cobbled streets, lots of gate-kept university spaces, and many, many tourists. What we also have is the movement of different kinds of mobilities, from cycles to delivery robots now. And we've had incidents recently of delivery robots sort of stalling and blocking the way of people moving in the streets, including quite dangerously firefighters in Cambridge who've had to physically lift a delivery robot and move it out of their way. Yet there is also magic in and hope in dreams for AI in the street. So the purpose of AI in the Cambridge street was potentially to solve the problem of crowding, of risk-taking and accidents at crossings, and to be able to make predictions based on existing traffic flows to figure out where housing should go, because there's actually quite a significant shortfall of housing across this country and in Cambridge especially, because there's just so many more people now gravitating to the town. So the government broadly and our local council partner identified places where they found people taking lots of risks in crossing the streets and in moving through the city. Because what's happened is across these different scales of mobility, we found that they found that for people to speak across mobilities is really fraught, and people moving at different speeds is really fraught to negotiate. So the idea was to use AI to make models of how people move in Cambridge and to potentially use that to better enable traffic flows through signaling, through nudging people and vehicular traffic. Now, we found two things that happened in our walks. First, that we were mapping data infrastructure. So for things like, not just CCTV camera, but also just like sensors. And you should be able to see on your screen, actually, there's a close-up of a poster that was stuck to a lamp post. It's capturing mobility data. And what's interesting about the sticker is it says very clearly, this is not CCTV camera, because this is actually a country that knows very well that it is constantly being surveilled. And it says, this is not CCTV camera, this is only data capture. And it gives a link there on that little poster about where you might go to know what kinds of data is being captured and how it's being used. And this is sort of something interesting that came out in the Cambridge Observatory, as opposed to places like London and Edinburgh and in Queensland, where people talked about surveillance a lot. But here we saw this sort of flip where it wasn't really surveillance, but it's kind of full transparency about data capture. And I think this sort of led us to think about how, what happens when you fetishize transparency to the extent where it becomes sort of its own thing, and there is no opportunity to ask, what is it for, or can we opt out? The other thing that we found was this discomfort of seeing the street through the experience of disabled users, even though there is a very strong public commitment to access. We also saw doubt in how and if AI can deliver on its promises, and in doing so, in doing so, does it violate rights and freedoms? I think we're seeing greater awareness here in the UK about concerns associated with technology, and recent surveys show that people trust social media platforms and big tech companies less and less. The other thing I want to say in sort of coming to the end of this presentation was to recognize the distance between the kinds of data that make sense to somebody who's disabled and to sort of AI systems broadly. So what you can also see on the screen here is blister paving that blind users and low-sighted users use to navigate the street. And the kind of data that activates AI as an imaginary is not this kind of data, but AI is sort of set up as this prediction machine that's able to preempt how people move in space, but how a disabled user orients themselves in space and how they actually rely on other humans in their space to create a sensory and embodied map of knowledge making speaks to a very different scale of knowing and of moving through space. So I want to sort of like close by trying to think more expansively about what kinds of knowledge and insight we actually need if we are to sort of deploy these AI systems in our local spaces, but also in doing that, what breaks in the adoption of these systems, and does it work for those who lie outside of the understanding of the norm? Because we know from this recent history of AI and algorithmic technologies that it tends to break when it encounters those considered outside the norm. And yesterday at the conference that I've been at, the media scholar Mark Andreevich made a remark that generative AI was sort of always coming, because the scale of the data we've been collecting over the last 10, 15 years can only be made sense of by other kinds of large models. And now we have generative AI technologies that can kind of parse and work through all the models, the data that we have. But yet we're still here, still human, still figuring out what it means to actually share local spaces together. And what I want to offer in closing, that it is in pushing forward the sort of idiosyncrasies and uniqueness and the noise of our embodied and shared spaces, that we might sort of turn these systems inside out and start remaking what it means to know each other in local spaces. So to sort of advance the diversity and the noise of little models rather than sameness and homophily. And I'm going to stop there and happy to be part of discussions following this. Thanks.
I feel like I'm left with an impossible task of trying to come up with a set of questions that unite these four practices and ways of thinking. But one aspect of the work that seems to be somewhat in common in what all four of you presented is, let's say, an intuition to always start with a very specific structural critique. And somehow the critique of that structural condition produces an alternative to what we deem to be, let's say, normative generative AI. So, and thinking through that, I'm also trying to imagine what it means to think of the world through a set of sites of data extraction, and how it seems as if this widening pit of data extraction will eventually swallow us all. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, maybe all four of you, around this feeling of being extracted, and how that feeling of being extracted produces new spatial practices, new means of representation, but also hopefully new forms of archives. Maybe Catherine, you can start.
Definitely think a lot about this notion of increasingly more and more spaces and more bodies doing different things are being turned into kind of data points and data sets, and also for me it's also a little bit speculative, kind of there's certain awareness of what is implemented in the world, maybe what data sets are being collected and what are available, to whether they're open source or privatized. But then there's this sense that you often have enough information to start to think without evidence of it, sort of what's coming, a little bit like this near future. So for me, that was sort of thinking about the home, for instance, based on what we know, what seems to be coming in the way that the home could be the producer of a data set. And I even start to think about, in some of my work with more like workplaces and extracting labor data from workers, about how, for instance, with one of the things with activity recognition that I'm interested in is that maybe it's quite, in terms of the data sets, it's quite a long way behind image recognition. You know, we've had these massive data sets for image object recognition for quite a while. There's been a lot of cultural interpretation of like ImageNet as a data set, and but when you dig into activity recognition, the data set's very small, or but you can see kind of some benchmarking, and so it makes me think, I wonder what products could be invented just to collect data. Like they're not even really for whatever service or they're providing. It's just a kind of ruse in a way. And I think about that with workplaces and the way they're installing surveillance cameras and activity recognition to think about health and safety. And it's sort of presented as health and safety, and then you look in a little bit and it's actually about productivity as well. But also companies that can do this can really extract a lot of data set, and then that's a huge position of power to develop new technology. So I've been interested in that, in this sense of like this increasing everything being turned into data. But I think for me, it's also like approach of like how to design research your way through it. Of course, there are moments where people might say, just throw out the model, like you should not be allowed to do it. But I think I'm also interested maybe with everybody, where are the moments that you might want to say abolish and no, and then where are the moments that you say, well, this is interesting, maybe there's creative potential and other perspectives.
Okay. All right. So my taking of your question is going to focus on the point of extraction,
Mhm.
right? And my thoughts on that is that extraction is nothing new,
Yeah.
right? It's how nations have been built. I'm from the Caribbean. We have been sites of extraction, right? So extraction is nothing new. I think the continued problem with extraction that has always been the problem of extraction is who controls what's extracted, who benefits or uses it, what is extracted, and how that thing is used or reframed and who it benefits, right? So that's the problem historically of extraction. And so what is I think the only difference is now it's in your home, right? It's actually in your house, as Catherine mentioned. But the problem of extraction that people have been going through for centuries, it's now in someone else's backyard. For me, one question is about those things. How are we deciding or engaging with who controls the things that we extract, the terms under which we are extracting it, or redescribing things that may be absolutely foreign to us? How are we repatriating knowledges and or the things that we learn or benefit from by doing these things? So I think it's an understanding of or a reckoning that this is not new. It's now probably touching you in ways that it hasn't been before, but it's nothing new.
For me, to the first section of my presentation where I'm describing kind of the trajectory of being like my location being extracted, that's where I started with these location intelligence systems. It's kind of consenting to being like a ping, and to do that in order to kind of get closer to the system to understand it, because I think that there's a challenge of transparency with how this information is being processed. There's an understanding that it's ubiquitous, and my location services had previously been turned like all the way off on everything, and just opening them up and then suddenly getting the notifications and the feedback. And seeing my Google Map change on a day-to-day basis was teaching me something about the way these systems are operating, and doing it in a way that I felt like I could consent to that for myself, and I squared that with myself. Would I want to use the result of other people's pings without also engaging in like that kind of process of gathering and like, you know, confirming like their consent? No. So with myself, it was more of like a personal exploration of the ways in which that like tension manifested in my practice. And that's why I think like right now how I feel about the overall like what it is as a practice that I presented. There's quite a split between the analysis of like a type of platform company and a presentation of an alternative. And I'm not sure I'm actually going to try to reconcile them as much. I think at one point I was also going to take what I was learning about my own process of being, you know, like my location being extracted, and try to do something at scale, like work with OpenStreetMap, work with Wikipedia, you know, work with large corpora. And what we're saying, I think through our presentations about just the importance and the like specificity of working with like smaller, unruly, very highly contextualized data with source analysis with specific questions. Is where I'm going.
Great. Maya?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, success. Okay, great. Thank you to the people working behind the scenes to make all of that possible. Well, I actually think that the three friends on the panel have said it really well already. I like the questions that Vernelle was actually asking just now about, and you know what you were saying about extraction and the sort of the slowness, or the, you know, I think Dan was talking about like unruliness as well. Trying to find ways to manifest that in classrooms, in projects that we're doing with collaborators, I think is part of the work. If we actually have to think about comparing like to like and managing extractivism on this at the scale at which it happens, it will never be possible. So we can only sort of like acknowledge our own scales, because if you didn't, then it would be very dispiriting. I'll also offer that, one of the things I've learned working with Louise, and I'm sorry she can't join us today, one of the things I've learned by working with her is that she once said to me, she said, disabled people don't actually ever want things to work perfectly all the time, because once things speed up and move fast, you get left behind. And I think that there's something in that, this sort of idea of unruliness and messiness and kind of slowing things down at the scale that you are at. And that's become like a little bit of a mantra to me. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Great. There are a set of questions scrolling and being gathered. I'll just pick one of them. Vernelle, one question is directed to you. Can you speak to the creation of your data set? Was this in collaboration with the community/communities? And what was the ultimate size of the set?
Sure. So the data set comprised of images scraped from online, as well as images that I have from fieldwork. This happened during the pandemic, so it was a, online project. How we did engage with, there were three parts of this, well, two, this and one around dance. And how we engaged with our publics, so to speak, was we had online Zoom workshops so that we could show them what we were doing, engage with some of the tools and play with them, and share them out. So we, conducted workshops, got feedback, shared things out. And so the project, when it comes to the technical part of the project that irritated me, but it'll be okay. So this was built on Mozilla Hubs, and they've since disconnected Mozilla Hubs or discontinued it. So I'm in the process of rebuilding it in Unity. But it was an online space that anyone could literally go in, and you meet someone, you could speak with them in there. So that was how we engaged with persons during the pandemic around the project. Mm-hmm.
Great. There are a few questions directed to Dan and Catherine, but maybe I can try to combine a few and ask you guys a question. What I loved about both of your approaches is the ambition towards intervention. And Catherine, you were talking about a set of tactics. So it seems as if even the tactics themselves will evolve over time as you encounter new models or new data sets. And Dan, I was really interested in the questions around counter cartography. And even though it started from this personal reflection, it seems as if you were already in conversation with a set of, anti-colonial texts and theory that are very much thinking about cartography as something that concretizes the boundaries, and limits movement. So, if you can talk about counter cartographies, maybe, and Catherine, if you can maybe discuss this notion of the tactic.
For me, I think that's why I focus so much on place in this research, because concepts of place resist enclosure, they resist easy definition, they resist computation and representation, but they still appear and reappear within computational systems. And when you have these very prevalent, like kind of roving global data sets advancing what defines a place, that's the kind of point that I want to head towards, in terms of intervention. Because places appear, in memory, in dreams, in your day-to-day life. They're personal. They could never be represented on a map, but they definitely appear within computational systems as well, within corpora. So that's what I'm focusing on, is the kind of like counter-cartographic crux. In making maps, I also have been thinking about kind of rendering texts more cartographically, which is to say, like structuring them spatially,
Yeah.
and seeing what comes up from that. Because there's also there's obviously like a boundedness to the corpus and boundaries to a text, but Maya put this really well about the spatiality of language models.
Yeah.
And that's also something that I've been looking into, just to kind of like think of it more expansively as well.
Yeah, so I guess, well, one of my tactics that I named was counter algorithm. So I'm aware that there's so many counter projects, right? And they can take so many different forms. And I think for me, just coming from a background with critical code studies, it's always important that for me the tactic sort of exists within code and is kind of has this executable quality to it still, that there's some sort of like technical and material reality to it, even if it's sloppy and extremely experimental. But at the same time, sometimes I think that the less computable something is, the more space it has to kind of think about that, like almost the counter algorithmic imaginary.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I definitely see value in projects that are more just graphic or experimental, and that things don't have to run through code. I mean, I think dissecting my work into a series of tactics was just really interesting for me. Like, I don't tend to think about the local in using that term as much, but it was interesting to me to think how I was always thinking about legibility and legibility to a local audience, and that seems to drive so many of those tactics in a way that hadn't really given it that language before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. I don't know if we have time, but I was going to ask one question to Maya. Okay. Maya, I mean, I guess in your engagement with disability studies, especially as it relates to computation and AI, one thing I was thinking about is the role of solidarity when it comes to doing this type of critical work. Because at least, I have very limited knowledge of AI, but in my thinking around it, it's always associated with, a larger entity that we are fighting against. But it seems like in your work, you're really trying to think carefully about a form of solidarity that will produce knowledge that could eventually unsettle the activities of, these big tech companies. So if you can talk about solidarity.
Thank you so much. I feel that you kind of already said it in that very poetic way in framing that question. This is the first time I've actually done something on disability. Quite honestly, I think I've worked on other kinds of marginality and exclusion issues, and very much thinking, and mostly in the context of harassment in street spaces, but also in online spaces. I would say that in those experiences, but also in working with Louise and sort of reading disability justice scholars and following Louise's work as well, I think that there's a way that you have to sort of like get outside yourself a little bit and become part of your solidarity has meant to me, I think, becoming part of that way of thinking and seeing space and inhabiting space. What was very disturbing, I think, for people on the Access data walk was getting like a little glimpse into what solidarity looks like, because you have to see it from that person's perspective, and not in the sense of, you have to walk 1,000 miles in somebody's shoes or whatever, because I don't think that's what empathy is, and I don't think that's necessarily what solidarity is. That's a very literal understanding of those words. But for some people, you do have to make that first step. You do have to see something from the perspective of somebody in a wheelchair. I think for me, it's been thinking about sort of like the big scale of systems. one of the things that has made a big difference to me is actually thinking about time and the politics of time and scale when you work with somebody who moves at a different speed and scale. And that's actually just through doing work together. And going back to what Wendy Chun says about stepping outside your comfort zone and stepping and going into places that are different and make you feel like, oh, I'm actually somebody who has power in this scenario. I'm actually somebody who is different because I don't have that marginal position. That difference sort of has made me think about how I have taken so many things for granted, but working with a disabled scholar has kind of made me aware of like the expectations I have for what meaningful work is, and what is the scale and what is the outcome and who it's actually really for. So I would say that actually, I mean, solidarity is kind of a doing. It's not I don't know, it's not like it's not something that I can think of as just like a value or something that we should. And, you know, it is very much an embodied and a real sort of experience that is very uncomfortable as well. And that discomfort is sort of part of being in solidarity with people. And I think we need like an appetite for it, but also a way to metabolize what that means. It's very easy to talk about solidarity, but much harder to kind of metabolize our differences and just kind of like sit with those and still work together and produce work together. Yeah. I hope that's a suitable answer to your question.
No, excellent answer.
Thank you.
How much time? We're good. Okay. Thank you guys for this excellent conversation.